Buenos días, good morning. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos una vez más. Thank you for being here in our daily webinar as part of the Hispanic Response and Recovery Plan, a plan to mitigate the impact of COVID in our Hispanic community, knowing how disproportionately were affected small businesses, entrepreneurs, independent workers that have lost their salaries, their income, their contract, were disproportionately affected at the health level, at the economic level, and we're also disproportionately exposed because we're in the front lines, running the country, we're in the hospital, 19 million Hispanics in essential functions, and our hearts and our minds are in Latin America as well, that right now is exploding with COVID. In the case, like it's more personal than anything for me with my mother in intensive care in Mexico. It is a pleasure for me to welcome today one of the role models, one of the highest Hispanic stars that I know, El Presidente, Luis Alberto Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank. Presidente Luis Alberto, muchas gracias for being with us today.
Gracias a ti, Claudia. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and congratulations for everything that you're doing and for all the tough times that you've had with your mother and doing everything that you're doing. But fortunately, from what you were telling me offline, she's doing better. So, I mean, that's the case of so many Hispanics that we don't know. And as you correctly say, they're all in the front lines and we owe them a lot.
And I, Presidente, from you, I learned so much. I learned actually how important it is to be unified and to gather collective action, and how important it is to have a plan for us as a Hispanic community to recover looking forward. But I want to invite you, if you don't mind, just to talk to us today about the impact of COVID on Latin America. Again, we have an incredible relationship with our countries at the remittance level, financially, emotionally, personally. So I would like you to talk to us and learn about the current efforts that the Inter-American Development Bank has in Latin America to mitigate those efforts. So the first question is, a lot of us here in the States are familiar with COVID-19 and what's happening locally. So I would like to invite you to tell us a little bit more about the situation in Latin America and the Caribbean, and how is this crisis affecting the countries and the region?
Well, Claudia, as you know, normally we get things in Latin America late, and perhaps this time around it was good that we got the COVID late, because it started, as we all know, in Asia. It started in China. It spread very quickly throughout Southeast Asia. Then it was the connectivity from Asia into Europe, and then from Europe into the United States, and then on to the rest of the world. And so, in a way, if the United States is 3 weeks behind or 2 weeks behind Europe, we're probably another 4 weeks behind or 3 weeks behind the United States. So the peak of the spread of the virus is just coming. What did Latin American countries do? Very quickly, starting in the middle of March, some faster than others. Some states within some countries did it faster than others. But in reality, most countries started in the middle to late March to begin to do the lockdowns. That essentially created a moment where the so-called R factor, this is the capacity of the virus to reproduce, at least began to flatten. But notwithstanding, we certainly have much bigger challenges, in the sense that our health systems, which we have seen everywhere, have been overwhelmed, especially in developed countries, which have a very strong systems in place. That's not the case in Latin America. I mean, the numbers of, just to give you an example, the number of intensive care unit beds are probably on average far less than half of what you have, say, in the United States or in Europe, for that matter. So we had to begin to adopt to this process in a time where getting access to medical equipment was extremely difficult. There was always almost like a mercado persa, like a wild west of sorts, in which there was a fundamental challenge, as you would hear here, even in the US, in New York, where you're at, from Governor Cuomo, how states were trying to fight with each other to get access to test equipment, to respirators, to face masks, to medical equipment. And what we soon found was that in every country in Latin America, these were all sectors of the economy that had very high protection. So the duty rates were very high. And there were a number of companies hiding behind those protections, not to mention the regulatory aspects. So that made it very difficult to speed up the process of having access to tests. Finally, that's starting to happen. And all in all, I mean, I look at these numbers every day. We're close to a little bit over 300,000 cases in Latin America already. The number of deaths is still low, but it all depends country by country where you increase the amount of testing. And as you increase the amount of testing, you begin to better understand where the society is in general, and this is what helps flatten the curve. These are the experiences of countries like South Korea or Singapore that very quickly were able to flatten the contagion curve. Now, so the challenge therefore going forward is this balance between protecting lives and livelihoods. And in this regard, as we talk about protecting livelihoods, the shocks to Latin America, which are largely supply shocks, are very deep. Think for a minute countries in Central America or Mexico or the Caribbean, which depend highly on tourism, which basically has disappeared, not to mention the remittances. This is, speaking to Hispanics, especially in the US, who every year send a lot of money, in excess of $65 billion a year to Latin America. That number is going to drop by, we estimate, by about 20%. Then the prices of commodities, there's been a tremendous downward pressure on all commodities, but especially on mineral commodities because they're connected to where the developed world is. And so these are things like steel, like copper, like silver and others, where the price points have come down severely. One of which, as we all know, has been oil, not only because of the excess of supply, but the shock in demand that has brought a tremendous downward pressure on oil prices. And we see today countries like Mexico or Colombia or Venezuela or Argentina or Brazil that are suffering because they either produce gas and or oil. And the one commodity, of course, that only has come up in price is gold. The other aspect, which is very critical, is the amount of money that has left emerging markets. This is probably 3 times higher during the financial crisis over 10 years ago. Some estimates exceed $100 billion, which means that there is a sudden stop in financing. And today, the one thing that we see at the end is, even though we flatten the curve on the contagion, the curve on employment, the curve on poverty, and the curve on debt, both from households, from corporates, and from governments, is all skyrocketing. So these are the challenges that we have in front of us. They're very daunting, and we're living these moments in ways where governments are trying to balance and protect lives, while at the same time beginning to find ways to reopen the economies in ways that are much safer with strong protocols such that you can continue to protect lives. So I'll stop there and happy to follow up.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, and it is very important. We've been hearing both narratives, how important it was that we were late in Latin America so that we can take some of the lessons learned, but at the same time, we don't have enough material, but because every mask in the world has been bought, we don't have access to the latest developments. The remdesivirs of the world are not getting to our countries. And at the same time, economically, I think that what you're suggesting is that there is, there's going to be a higher impact because, again, if we look at America, the government is stepping up in a number of ways for small businesses and entrepreneurs in a situation where Latin America cannot cope with oil prices and so on. So what are you doing through the bank to support? Where did you see, when you're looking at all that, you're saying like, okay, so where do I put my priorities and what can I do that is, what can I do to help?
Well, the first priority and the immediate priority was to help governments get access to all this medical equipment. So what we did was take undisbursed loan balances that the bank had and quickly work with each and every government and not only help them get access to financing, but equally help them by curating a set of suppliers from around the world who could provide the respirators, the testing equipment, the face masks, you name it. And so that we've done to the tune of about $350 million, which for this kind of medical equipment, buys you a lot of things, but not enough. And certainly governments were doing their part as well. Then we concentrate in how you continue to strengthen all the health systems in the different countries by not only building up more capacity, more hospital beds, more intensive care units, such that the health systems can at least withstand the huge needs that are going to be coming as a result of COVID. Secondly, as a consequence of COVID, we have seen the enormous impacts on the economies. And so the first thing is, how do you help in a region where you have 50% of the labor force in the informal labor market? How do you begin to, not only that, but families that are in the margins of moving out of extreme poverty or in extreme poverty and into, middle classes, not to lose what they have accomplished over the last few years. And so that meant programs that you basically do income transfers such that people can, even by staying at home, continue to feed themselves. And last but not least, how do you protect jobs? And here, the work with the small businesses is fundamental. And also to provide liquidity to businesses such that they can continue to keep the jobs that they have. So this has been the bulk of what we have been doing, not only through what we call sovereign lending, that is lending to governments. This year, we will basically be disbursing about $15 billion. That's 50% more than what we normally do. And then on the private sector side, we will be doing another $7 billion. And this, again, is to support companies, to support banks that are lending to small and medium enterprises, to provide trade finance. This is something that, even though there's been a collapse in trade, what we found in the financial crisis is that the minute that the countries began to lose their ratings, or at least see downgrades on the ratings, and it's a cascade almost, immediately banks began to retrench, especially global banks. And so here you gotta help the local banks and provide them with the kind of financing that they can continue to finance trade. And so those are some of the things that we have been doing. On top of course, and the more critical one is what we provide, which is knowledge. And that is bringing the best practices from around the world, listening what countries like Germany, like Singapore, like South Korea, China, and others have done in terms of dealing with the COVID, and thinking of ways of how to, experiences from Israel as an example, of how to restart the economies and how it has been done, how to use tracking systems, how to protect people as you fix yourself on, first of all, keeping the supply system of food for everybody, which is so critical. We've seen already some breakdowns on this. But at the same time, those job intensive kind of industries, because, we do telework and for us it's normal, but that is for people in Latin America is a luxury. Not everybody can do telework. People work with their hands, or they are, informal little mom and pop type of shops, that depend on a number of things. So how to get them to be able to have a part of the economy. And these are, in the construction sector, for instance, which is a sector that has huge impacts on economic growth, but equally and most importantly on employing people. So these are the kinds of things that we have been working on. And we, of course, are now thinking more and more of where is the growth going to come? Mm-hmm. What are the structural changes that countries are going to be faced with in a time when governments are back and we're in a totally new world where we're going to have to basically, in all of it, learn to swim by swimming.
And I have so many questions on that knowledge and the best practices. I think that it is essential, essential to put together again. I would love to count on you and having the expertise also for the Hispanic community, because we're looking at what are the best practices of survival. And I think that we have to start looking at the best practices to put a recovery plan. This is not the first crisis that you have seen. I would love to hear how this differs to others. I would love to know whether Latin America, every country, is COVID affecting every country the same, or are there differences? What do you think is the time frame of the recovery? And lastly, just to pack it all there, what is the remittances? Like, what's the role? What do you think is gonna like how are remittances going to be affected as well?
Well, beginning with remittances, they were roughly anywhere from 65 to 70 billion dollars a year. A third of those remittances were going to Mexico. We estimate that there will be a drop of about 20% this year as a result of those Hispanics that live in the United States that are probably under some form of unemployment insurance or lost their job or got a pay cut. You know, all of those effects, people are going to feel back home. And so that's the first kind of impact that we see in terms of the drop in remittances, like I say, around 20%. In terms of, you know, where countries are, I think it all depends. I'll give you an example. Chile, for instance, soon after the outbreaks in Asia. Let me just preface this here. Let's recall that, you know, Asia went through SARS, through MERS, through H1, and they've had over the last 15 years, maybe every 4 or 5 years, some outbreak of a pandemic. And in a sense, especially on these respiratory type of pandemics, they were already in a much better place than, say, in Latin America and the Caribbean, where we essentially have diseases that are basically coming from neglected tropical diseases. And these are diseases that are transmitted by insects, things like malaria, things like chikungunya. They all come, as you know, from unserved water systems, lack of water and sanitation, etc. So we had a very different kind of situation in which we were certainly not ready to deal with something like this. But a country like Chile, for instance, started soon after the outbreak in Korea, very quickly learned what Korea was doing. And, you know, one of the successes of Korea is they saw the problem, they realized that they needed to profoundly expand the amount of testing. And so they went to their companies and said, we need to ramp up the production of testing capacity. I mean, not every country can do that because these were equipments largely imported to many countries. Yet Korea had that capacity. There is the country that probably produces the large amount of tests is probably China. And so they very quickly started doing, ramping up the production. And that's what allowed them to very quickly, you know, get not only you know, manage the curve, but really make it come down. And I think today, they don't even have one case a day, you know, and this started there in the middle of February. So Chile saw that, bought a lot of equipment and got ready and started doing all the testing. And today they're reopening their economy and they are doing very well. Other countries started much later. You have extremes, like say the case of Venezuela, which we don't really know much about what's going on. And then you have cases like Haiti, where you essentially are gonna have to rely on herd immunity, as it's called, because their health system was insufficient even for the current circumstances before the COVID. And so it's gonna be very interesting to see what eventually happens in a country like Haiti, where we're gonna, you know, there's really no capacity there to deal with the problem. Then there's the larger countries, your country, Mexico, countries like Brazil, where there are federal systems and where Some governors decided to do lockdowns against the will of the central government. In the case of Brazil, it was clearly both Sao Paulo and Rio. Today, Brazil is probably the country with the largest amount of cases and is becoming a major, major issue. Equally in Mexico, you had Jalisco, for instance, which very quickly, as you know, did a number of decisions that allowed Jalisco to bring back down the level, the so-called R factor to 1 or below. So that's, it's been different from country to country. And I think, again, this is a disease that caught everybody by surprise. And we have learned a lot as we go along. And people who not only get the disease, there's a lot of things that we're learning from people who got the disease and heart problems, problems of circulation, skin related diseases. So there's a lot of things that come as collateral damage, if you might, of the disease. And so these are some of the situations in Latin America. And then, this won't finish until we have a day in which, this disease, we have a vaccine for the virus that is readily available like an aspirin anywhere in the world.
And again, I would love to hear more about the time frame and everything. I know that we have, we have come to the time, but how long is Latin America going to be, we've been talking about states and we've seen already Europe coming back to some degree because of all the circumstances that you've said. What's your time frame for Latin America?
Look, I think it depends country to country. What you see in most countries today is that they are beginning already gradually a process of bringing back the economy in certain sectors. But for the most part, I would say towards the end of this month, you will see much more of the non-essential businesses begin to open. And here I refer to things like commerce. And still you will continue to have social distancing and especially a lot of protection for the elderly population, people over 60 and over or 65. They have to take much more care. And they probably, people would prefer for them to be at home, and for those who can do telework to continue to do telework.
And President, we are trying to bring all the Hispanic leaders together to respond together, to collaborate, coordinate, don't duplicate, just like have an action together to respond. But we do have to come up with a response plan, with a recovery plan. And for that, I would love to count on you and be part of that, sharing best practices from other communities, what you're seeing that you would apply for the Hispanic community as well, since we're so connected to Latin America. And in that sense, do you have a final message for the Hispanic leaders that are listening today and that we will share this information with them?
Look, I always think back and look at history and look at what humanity has gone through in so many different times in our history. And I always think that we gotta look at this, aside from the huge human suffering that we have, it is in moments like this that humanity gets the best out of itself. We come back to moments of caring much more about others, of more solidarity, but equally of more creativity. You love art. The Renaissance period happened in moments of tremendous stress in the midst of wars. And I hope that this time also, not only do we learn a lot, we learn that we depend so much on each other, not only across this hemisphere, but around the world, and that there can be a huge cycle of innovation coming out of this. I believe that there's going to be a lot of lessons learned. I think this is the time to make it not just in America, but in the Americas, where value chains are being totally rethought, and that probably we can begin to produce things that we had not in the past, all this medical equipment, all these things that we should be able to source everything around technology. We're starting on this race, everybody at the same day. So that level of creativity and connectivity that we have around the world might just very well be a place to start. So I just think, and I hope that we get not the negative, there always be negatives, but that this can turn out into a moment of much bigger cooperation around the world.
And we hope that too. President Luis Alberto Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Un abrazo.
Bye.